Izumiya Ryota was absorbed in his solitary reading in the classroom. He thought he liked that seat because it offered the peace and quiet he needed to read his light novels without interruptions. As he observed his surroundings, Ryota noticed that the popular students were still making noise as usual, and thus reaffirmed that if he were forced to socialize with them, he would rather remain a gloomy and solitary otaku. With great satisfaction, Ryota told himself that that seat was, as always, the best of all. Furthermore, he reasoned that only the second and third tier students in the class sat around him, and so he concluded that that corner was, without a doubt, the best seat in the universe. With his eyes closed, he promised himself he had to enjoy every second of that paradise. However, his peace was shattered when a voice exclaimed, drawing everyone's attention. A smiling classmate informed the class that it was seat-changing day. Upon hearing this, Ryota reacted with a mix of horror and panic. Later, two classmates commented that it was the first time all year that a seat change had happened. One of them revealed that it was said to have been Kuroki, the class representative, who had requested it from the teacher. Upon hearing this, Ryota exploded in a frustrated thought, cursing Kuroki for always meddling in things that didn't concern her. He believed that for a loner like himself, a seat change was high risk and offered no benefit. Immediately afterward, the class representative Kuroki announced to her classmates that she was going to post the list with the new seats and asked them to take a look. As the students moved around the classroom checking the seating chart, a classmate approached Ryota, apologizing slightly while loudly celebrating that she got to sit next to Suzuki. Ryota, visibly nervous, wondered what his new fate would be. Then, approaching the list, Ryota looked at it alongside his classmates. But what he saw next left him speechless. The seating chart became visible, clearly showing his name. Ryota, completely shocked, wondered if his seat was truly in the center of the classroom. This shocking discovery sent him into a state of terror, and he exclaimed that everything was over. Ryota, visibly shaken by his location, had a fleeting hopeful thought, wondering if perhaps he was surrounded by other misfits like himself in the center of the room, while nervously smiling at two classmates who seemed to be happily chatting about anime. However, upon carefully examining the seating chart, he could see that his name, Ryota Izumiya, was surrounded by Ikenos on the left and Kuroki on the right, with Miyama directly in front of him. Realizing the gravity of the situation, Ryota screamed in his mind, expressing his confusion and asking what was happening. Then he stood up, looking around and seeing how his classmates seemed to celebrate his new position, commenting that Ryota's seat was amazing, and that, in fact, it was the best seat. Completely desperate, Ryota asked himself why he had to be a misfit. As one of the popular girls, sitting near him, looked at him with a smile, he asked himself in anguish why it had to be him who ended up in that seat. Finally, he found himself standing among a group of popular girls, including Miyama, and wondered in dismay how he had ended up sitting in such a place. Ryota, in a state of absolute panic, realized that being surrounded by three classes girls was, without a doubt, the worst seat of all. He watched as his classmates, oblivious to his torment, commented that those three were the center of the class and the elite of the group, and that they would love to get close to them, feeling envious of his position. Ryota lamented internally that his ideal was to be in a corner enjoying his light novels without drawing attention, and declared that this was hell. Even though he felt overwhelmed, he realized he had never seen them from so close. At that moment, Miyama Eri appeared, described as the embodiment of beauty, and just as flirtatious as always. Ryota noticed with terror that she was sitting in the seat in front of him, and immediately concluded that this was the worst thing that could have happened. Shortly after, the girls began interacting around him. One of them commented to another that Yuria's nails were super pretty and asked if she had done them herself, calling her skill amazing. The girl in question, Ikenos Yuria, whom Ryota described as a Jaru with a somewhat subdued vibe, modestly replied that she hadn't done anything special and simply said, "Thanks." Meanwhile, Ryota watched the interaction, thinking to himself that although he liked Jaru thighs in fiction, he didn't feel comfortable around Jaris in real life and was afraid they would look down on him. That's when one of the girls addressed him and said their seats were close, asking if Rui-chan had purposely arranged for them to sit near each other. As the popular girls continued their lively conversation, Ryota, in a state of growing anxiety, realized that the one behind the whole seat change situation was none other than Kuroki Rui. At that very moment, the class representative, Kuroki Rui, approached him with a smile, greeted him with Izumiya-kun, and said it had been a while since she last saw him, still smiling. The class rep introduced herself as Kuroki Rui, the class delegate, and told him that from that moment on, they would be seat neighbors, and that it would be a pleasure. Ryota responded awkwardly, stammering that it was a pleasure, though internally screaming that everything was her fault, and that because of her, he had ended up in that seat. Meanwhile, the social interactions continued around him. One of the girls wondered aloud what was going on, and another noticed that the teacher was about to arrive. Indeed, the teacher appeared shortly afterward, announcing that although the seat change was already done, he asked the students not to get too excited. He explained that on this occasion, the class rep Kuroki had insisted quite a bit to allow the seat change, but warned them not to expect it to happen again, since there would be no more useless seat swaps. Ryota listened to the teacher's words with a terrified look, still not fully understanding what was happening. At that moment, it was announced that class was over, and Ryota, still wearing a horrified expression, asked aloud if they wouldn't be changing seats again until the end of the second year. The popular girls continued their conversation, and one of them asked Kuroki if she knew that guy, referring to Ryota. When one of the classmates asked Kuroki if she knew the protagonist, the class rep confirmed it, revealing that they had been classmates in middle school. While the girls chatted, Ryota tried to regain his composure, wondering whether he should try to calm himself with a light novel, and if Kuroki really remembered him, though he admitted he couldn't help but start to worry. At that moment, Miyama Eri, who was sitting in front of him, turned around to make a comment that embarrassed him deeply. The book he was reading had pretty risque drawing. Desperate, Ryota begged her internally to please be quiet. Eri's gaze sent him into a panic, as he feared she would look at him with disgust and wondered just how humiliated he might end up being. Fortunately, Ikenos Yuria intervened, asking if they wanted to go buy cosmetics with her that day. Ryota felt relieved, thinking the teasing was over, and silently thanked Yuria for interrupting. He wondered if they were now deep into a girl's talk. Rui then mentioned to Miyama Eri that she was free because there was no track practice that day and asked if Eri was also available. Miyama Eri reacted with noticeable discomfort, replying with a flustered murmur and hesitating about her availability. When asked if she was free, Eri responded with a nervous smile and an apologetic expression, saying sorry because she was going to skip today, and explained that her boyfriend had told her he wanted to go to Starbucks after class. Ryota, who had been listening, wondered internally if she and her boyfriend were really going to Starbucks, while the other girls, with understanding expressions, said they got it, and that in that case, it was fine. Eri in turn offered them sincere apology. Eri, wearing a triumphant smile, thought it was incredible, and even though it didn't affect someone like Ryota, who was at the bottom of the social ladder, she did have plans. Meanwhile, Ryota was finally able to leave the school, feeling relieved. He thought the envious stares from the other boys had been unbearable, and that, without a doubt, it had been such a weird day. As he walked down the street, he noticed a couple and, with frustration, thought they were being way too affectionate, internally shouting a curse. However, despite the social chaos he had gone through during the day, Ryota felt a renewed sense of hope upon seeing the front of an anime store, remembering that he had his own world of manga and light novels that he adored so much. Besides, that day was the release day of the light novel he had been waiting for. But when he arrived at the store, Ryota's excitement was abruptly crushed by a sign showing the title of the novel, followed by the terrible news, sold out. Inside, a store employee regretfully informed Ryota that they were very sorry, but the product was sold out. Upon hearing this, Ryota reacted with a surprised and resigned expression, nodding slightly to indicate that it was okay, and that he understood. He thought it made sense, since the novel was Opusui, his favorite web series, and being one of the most popular ones, it was expected to sell out quickly. Desperate, Ryota wondered if he should try asking at a nearby bookstore. So, he pulled out his phone and called a shop, introduced himself, and asked if they could help him. Once someone answered, Ryota explained that he wanted to know if they had in stock a light novel that had just been released. He added that, although it was a little embarrassing to say the title out loud, he wanted to buy it if they had it. The person on the other end asked if he meant a light novel, then requested that he wait a moment while they checked for availability. Ryota noticed that the voice sounded somewhat cheerful. Soon after, the employee, with a voice that Ryota felt he had heard before, informed him that they believed there were 4 copies left. With his heart pounding, Ryota wondered if it was just his imagination or if he really recognized that voice from somewhere. Finally, the store gave him a clear response confirming the stock, and Ryota, with a smile of relief, thanked them with an enthusiastic, "Thank you so much for the information," and exclaimed that he was heading over right away. The employee on the phone replied cheerfully with a "You're welcome," and "See you soon." Ryota stared at his phone, a bit annoyed by the rushed ending, wondering whether the employee should have waited for the customer to hang up first. On his way to the bookstore, Ryota thought maybe the person he had spoken to was new, since their voice sounded young. Upon entering the store and greeting them, he introduced himself as the one who had called earlier about the book, only to find himself face to face with a familiar figure. The person helping him was none other than Miyama Eri. Wearing an apron and carrying a stack of books, with a trembling voice, she said, "Here it is," and Ryota, completely stunned, stammered as he realized it was the girl who sat right in front of him. Ryota screamed internally, utterly shocked, wondering if Miyama Eri was really working there. Eri, visibly embarrassed, held the books while looking at him, a blush spreading across her cheeks. Realizing how awkward the situation was, Ryota decided it would be best to pretend he hadn't seen anything. However, before he could act, Eri stopped him by placing a hand on his shoulder and saying, "Hey." With a deeply concerned expression, Eri stepped closer and asked if he was thinking about telling everyone that she worked there. Reacting under pressure, Ryota wondered in surprise what was going on with her. Eri continued, firmly stating that she worked within the hours allowed by school regulations and that she even had the school's permission. Miyama Eri, cheeks still red and with tears beginning to form in her eyes, asked Ryota again if he really intended to tell everyone about her job. Ryota, completely overwhelmed by the situation, could only respond by asking her to wait a moment. At that moment, a third employee, a short-haired girl, loudly intervened, exclaiming, "Stop right there," and warning that it wasn't allowed to fight with one's boyfriend while on the job. Upon hearing that, Eri panicked, screaming internally that he wasn't her boyfriend, and that the other girl should correct that assumption immediately. The short-haired employee resigned, then commented that there was nothing to be done about Eri's situation. She then turned to Eri and kindly asked her to go to the break room for a moment, to which Eri nodded without hesitation. Additionally, her coworker added, while looking at Ryota, that the little boyfriend could come along too. And so, the two of them were led to the break room. Inside, Eri and Ryota sat side by side, the tension in the air thick, neither daring to look at the other. Finally, Eri broke the silence and apologized, saying it was all her fault. Ryota also apologized, saying that he was sorry as well. Despite the exchange of apologies, Ryota felt the situation was overwhelming. He thought Eri was far too close to him in that small break room. In that cramped space, Ryota reflected that for a loner like him, being so close and alone with someone else was just too much. Sensing his discomfort, Eri asked if he knew that she had suddenly become scared. She then confessed that she had been thinking about what would happen if people started calling her that poor girl again, like they used to. Ryota, confused by her words, asked what she meant by poor girl. Then, Eri, with a sorrowful expression, began to open up about her past. She explained that her family was indeed very poor, and that her father had died when she was little, so she had been raised solely by her mother ever since. She added that because of their financial situation, she couldn't receive an allowance, which had led to many difficult times. Ryota listened, moved by her confession, thinking that he never would have imagined Eri had gone through so much. She went on to explain that in middle school, it hurt her a lot to be left behind while her friends were experimenting with makeup, and she didn't want to go through that again in high school. That's why she had started saving money with all her might and studied hard about fashion and makeup. Finally, holding up a bottle of nail polish with a big smile, she concluded that she had finally become a cute version of herself. Eri continued her confession, explaining that in order to keep playing that cuter version of herself, she realized she needed money. Ryota then asked if that was the reason for her part-time job, to which Eri nodded seriously. Ryota reflected inwardly that having a job didn't necessarily mean being poor, but Eri went on to say that she didn't really mind if people called her that. She had gotten used to hearing it. However, she admitted that the only people she didn't want to find out were Yuria and Rui-chan, since they had been her friends since the first year of high school. Upon hearing this, Ryota leaned a little closer to her. With teary eyes, Eri repeated in a trembling voice that this was precisely why she didn't want them to find out. At that moment, Ryota was deeply moved. Recognizing Eri's sincerity, he turned toward her and confessed that, in truth, he respected her a lot. He explained that he had never bought anything with money he'd earned himself, and that in many ways, she was much more mature than he was. Eri listened to his words with a look of deep surprise and emotion. Ryota continued expressing his admiration for her, saying that for all those reasons, he could never make fun of someone like her, and swore he never would. However, immediately after saying it, he realized what he had just declared and screamed internally, wondering what the hell he was saying and how he had just blurted out something so embarrassingly heartfelt. Eri looked at him closely, moved by his seriousness, and gently told him, "Wow, you're actually much kinder than I thought," finishing her sentence with a warm smile on her face. Suddenly, Eri stood up, saying that she had to get back to work. Ryota was surprised to hear her, wondering if she was leaving already. Then, Eri asked if he hadn't come to buy a book. Realizing he had completely lost track of time, Ryota dropped to his knees, shouting that his Opusui book was gone, that he could have bought it if he hadn't gotten distracted, bitterly lamenting that it was no longer available. Finally, with his head hanging in defeat, Ryota let out a sigh of resignation. At that moment, Eri stepped closer to him and, in a quiet voice, asked if he had found the book he wanted. Embarrassed, Ryota shook his head and said that the book was sold out. Hearing this, Eri smiled, made a small sound, and then burst into spontaneous laughter, leading Ryota to think to himself that this kind of thing always happened with popular girls. Right after, Eri held something out to him and asked in a curious tone if he wanted to see it. When Ryota looked at what she was offering, he screamed internally. It was his Opusui book, the light novel he had wanted so badly. Then, Eri told him she had saved it for him, explaining that it was exactly the book he had asked for when he called a little while ago. Upon receiving the novel he had longed for, Ryota stared at it as if he were seeing an angel, and exclaimed that Eri really was an angel. In response, Eri, with a playful smile, asked where her thank you was for saving the book. Ryota, reacting quickly, bowed deeply and said, "Thank you very much for the book." However, Eri clarified that that wasn't the kind of thank you she meant, leaving Ryota confused, wondering what she meant by that. Eri explained that she had saved the book as a kind gesture, and that, in return, he should treat her to something. She added that now that Ryota had discovered her true nature, and since Eri was a girl interested in money, she asked why he didn't invite her to something at the cafe the next day. Realizing her proposal, Ryota screamed internally, "No, she's not an angel, she's a little demon." At that moment, Eri smiled again and casually asked what his name was. Ryota introduced himself as Izumiya Ryota. With a mischievous smile, she said, "Well then, Ryota, I'll see you tomorrow at lunch," adding that she was really looking forward to it. Ryota reacted with surprise, stammering a reply. But just then, Eri was called by her manager, who asked her to bring over the box. She nodded and replied, "Yes." Eri waved and said, "See you later," before walking away, leaving Ryota completely stunned. He remained frozen, staring in panic, unable to fully process what Eri had just suggested. Ryota wondered in terror whether he was actually going to have lunch with Miyama Eri, the most popular girl, at the cafe, and whether that wouldn't look incredibly weird. The next day, Ryota was back in his new seat in the center of the classroom, reflecting that, after the seat change, he had ended up surrounded by class girls, which most people would consider a dream come true. However, Ryota figured that kind of guy was probably only into 2D girls, and wondered why someone like him, a full-blown otaku, was going through all this. He decided that the best thing to do was to focus on his novel, the one he had fought so hard to get. At that moment, he noticed a pair of legs very close to him, which made him wonder whose they were. When he looked up, he found himself face to face with Ikenos Yuria, the apathetic Jaru, and let out a startled yell, wondering what she was doing there. Yuria looked at him intently and declared that she had remembered him. Ryota, scared and confused, asked what she meant by that and if she was some kind of delinquent. But just then Eri appeared and without hesitation greeted Asura, who cheerfully returned the greeting right away. Before leaving, Eri looked at Ryota and then gave him a knowing wink. He reacted to the gesture with a deep blush, wondering if, by doing that, they looked like a couple in secret. He tried to analyze the meaning of the wink, questioning whether it actually meant something, or if it was just a meaningless wink after all. Later, at the cafeteria, Eri, with a joyful expression, got ready to eat a large serving of curry, cheerfully exclaiming, "Bon appetit." Ryota, for his part, also wished her a good meal as he calmly ate his onigiri. While enjoying her food, Eri commented that it was very tasty, and gratefully thanked Ryota for having invited her to eat something a bit expensive from the menu. At the same time, she apologized for the cost. Ryota, with an understanding smile, assured her that it was no problem at all, and that, after all, it was a gesture of appreciation for what had happened the previous day. As they continued eating, Eri casually asked if everyone was watching them, which startled Ryota, prompting him to quickly turn his head to look around. Indeed, several classmates were watching them from other tables, and one of them even commented that he envied Eri and that guy. Hearing that, Ryota resigned himself, thinking to himself that, deep down, he had expected something like this. Then, Eri addressed Ryota by name, asking him to listen. Right after, she asked what he had been talking about with Yuria a little while ago. Eri remarked that it was unusual to see Yuria talking to a boy. Ryota froze for a moment, but then recalled the situation and explained that Yuria had told him she had remembered him. Eri, a bit puzzled, asked what he thought Yuria meant by that. Ryota shrugged and replied that was exactly what he would like to know. Taking the initiative, Eri then asked if he wanted her to ask Yuria directly. Ryota reacted with concern, questioning whether she thought Yuria might get upset with her. However, Eri, with a carefree smile, assured him that if that were the case, she knew a secret place Yuria often went to, and suggested that if he truly wanted to know, he could go ask her directly. Enthusiastically, she declared that this would be the operation to help him get along with Yuria. Ryota, surprised by Eri's energy, asked what exactly she was plotting, adding that he really did want to understand what Yuria meant by what she had said that morning. Eri then explained that after talking with him the day before, she had been thinking about how nice it was that they were getting along. She added that, since they were seated near each other, they should all try to get along. Ryota looked at her in amazement and could only say Eri's name softly. In that context, Ryota asked if she didn't think it would be better if she intervened directly. However, Eri thought that would be boring, so she decided not to. Seeing her determined and playful attitude, Ryota couldn't help but think of her as a little devil. Following Eri's advice, Ryota then headed to the place she had called Yuria's secret spot, which turned out to be a game arcade. However, as he looked around the machines, he realized he couldn't see her anywhere. That was when he heard the frantic noises of a claw machine. Looking closer, Ryota saw Yuria completely focused on the game. He observed her hands and noticed her well-manicured nails, and also noticed her tan. Then he realized she was trying to catch a milk tan figure. Meanwhile, he also noticed her thighs, and heard Yuria whisper that it was just a little more. At that moment, Ryota internally exclaimed the name Ikenos Yuria, and concluded that she seemed to be having quite a battle with the machine. As Yuria grew frustrated from failing to get the figure, Ryota closely examined the claw machine and wondered in astonishment how it was possible that a Jaru was trying to win an anime figure. Immediately, he panicked internally, wondering if maybe she was planning to resell it. Shortly after, when the game ended, Yuria announced that she would go get some change. Ryota was left alone for a moment before Yuria, turning around, saw him. Upon noticing him, she looked at him in surprise, and he asked what she was doing there. Yuria reacted with a panicked and blushing expression, asking Ryota if this wasn't deja vu, and added that now he knew her weakness. Then, she confronted him directly, asking whether he planned to tell everyone that she was trying to win that figure, and whether he intended to ruin her by revealing it. Ryota immediately replied, emphatically assuring her that of course he wouldn't do that. Trying to get closer to her and carry out Aries' suggested operation, Ryota dared to take her hand and told her that the truth was, he had also come to win that figure. He added, in an internal thought, that this was his strategy to be able to get along with her. Yuria looked at him wide-eyed, with an expression that was a mix of surprise and blushing. Ryota then asked Yuria directly why she wanted to get that figure, and whether she intended to give it to someone. At the question, Yuria looked at him with a serious and thoughtful expression, without saying a word. Since she didn't respond, the protagonist assumed that maybe she only wanted to resell it. However, that assumption triggered a burst of intense anger in Yuria. Without hesitation, she leaned toward him abruptly and demanded that he not place her on the same level as that kind of trash, and that he never compare her to people like that again. Yuria explained that she was trying to get the figure precisely to avoid having to resort to resellers. Ryota, visibly frightened, asked himself in panic what he should do, and whether mentioning reselling had been a terrible mistake. Then, Yuria firmly asked him if he was listening to her. Ryota reacted immediately, asking her to let him go for a moment because he wanted to focus. However, Yuria, realizing what he intended to do, told him to wait. Regardless, Ryota inserted a coin into the machine's slot and explained that claw machines weren't generous enough to let someone win on the first try, adding that he had only come there to get that figure. He then positioned himself in front of the claw machine, fully focused, and explained to her that the key to this kind of game was to grab the prize with gentle touches. Yuria watched him attentively as he inserted another coin. Ryota, now in complete control of the claw, told Yuria that this was the moment. She, surprised, looked at him expectantly as he skillfully maneuvered the controls, until finally the prize dropped. Yuria tried to let out an exclamation, but the sound came out as a faint murmur. However, upon seeing the figure come out of the machine, she expressed with great surprise and admiration that it was amazing, and that Ryota was truly amazing. Ryota then approached Yuria and, with a calm smile, handed her the box containing the figure. She received it with a cry of delight and happiness. Ryota watched her for a moment. Then, Yuria, visibly happy, turned to Ryota and asked if he was really sure about giving her the prize, considering he was the one who had won it for her. At her question, Ryota explained that he had only been able to get that figure because she had been trying so hard, so he believed that the figure belonged to her. Seeing the boy's surprised and unsure reaction, Yuria became very self-conscious, feeling the need to ask if he was going to make fun of her. Her biggest concern was that he would mock her for being a high school girl who liked anime figures like that. She confessed that no matter how much she thought about it, her own taste seemed strange to her. After processing the situation, Ryota responded that yes, her taste was unusual. However, he admitted that he was surprised she enjoyed an anime with such a specific theme. But he quickly softened his comment, assuring her there was nothing wrong with being proud of what you like. He went on to explain his own tastes, showing her his light novel. He explained that the reason he could speak so frankly was because he wasn't ashamed of what interested him, and that this was exactly what it meant to be an otaku. He even mentioned that he didn't use covers to hide his books. Finally, Ryota concluded by saying that he didn't think it was wrong if she decided to keep her hobbies private, if that was what she preferred. Then, with a smile, he advised Yuria that if she truly liked that work, she shouldn't belittle herself for it. Yuria, visibly moved and blushing, simply nodded in silence. However, Ryota, overwhelmed by embarrassment, scolded himself internally, wondering what he was even saying. After all, he was just a nobody. To escape the awkwardness, he tried to change the subject and asked Yuria if she didn't think it would be better to forget everything that had happened that day. But she rejected the idea completely. At that moment, Yuria, with a look of determination and deep blush on her face, made a surprising confession. She revealed that the reason she liked those things was because she was also an otaku. Ryota reacted with great astonishment and exclaimed if she was saying that she was an otaku. He then asked if that meant she had been secretly hiding that fact until now. But Yuria replied that she didn't think it was exactly like that. In other words, she didn't feel as though she had been actively hiding it. However, Yuria admitted that it was a bit difficult for her to openly show that hobby in front of her friends, Eri or Rui. The reason for her caution, she explained, was that they were very important friends to her, and she wouldn't want them to drift away just because she liked that anime. For that very reason, she confirmed that she hadn't told anyone about it. While Ryota looked at her thoughtfully and Yuria remained silent beside him, she happened to see other students laughing in the distance. At that moment, Ryota apologized to Yuria, admitting that he had probably said something very insensitive. She merely responded with a murmur. Immediately afterward, Yuria asked the protagonist if his name was Izumiya Ryota. When he confirmed, she told him to remember her name, saying it out loud herself, Izumiya. Then, she asked him to do her a favor. Yuria leaned in toward Ryota with a serious and pleading expression, and asked him, please, not to tell anyone that she was an otaku, emphasizing especially that he shouldn't tell Eri or Rui. Ryota, visibly nervous because of Yuria's closeness, assured her that he hadn't planned on telling anyone anyway, which drew from her a genuine sigh of relief. As she took something out of her bag, Yuria asked if, in that case, being with him meant she wouldn't have to hide her hobby. She mentioned that this made her feel more at ease. Then, Yuria came closer to Ryota and showed him a book, announcing that she had bought it too, revealing that this was what she had remembered that morning. Upon seeing the title, Ryota reacted immediately in astonishment, wondering internally whether the phrase, "I remembered," had actually referred to the title of the novel. Finally, with a determined expression, Yuria spoke directly and somewhat assertively to Ryota. She said that she had decided he would be her partner for an otaku talk, and demanded that he give her his line contact. However, Ryota quickly protested that she was being far too selfish. In response, Yuria adopted a more threatening attitude to force him to cooperate. She warned that if he refused, she would tell everyone something about him. Ryota reacted instantly, struck with panic, realizing she had noticed where he had been looking earlier. Yuria then proposed a deal. She told him that he would protect her secret, and in return, she would protect his. With a confident smile, Yuria confirmed that from that moment on, they would share a relationship based on mutual secrets. In the end, Ryota agreed to give her his line contact, and that way, Yuria was able to add him, successfully accomplishing her goal. And that was how the protagonist ended up forming a relationship with Ikuno's Yuria, the #1 Jaru in their class. A relationship a little different from the one he had with Eri. Later on, Ryota and Yuria left the building together. As they walked, Yuria asked him whether the novel she had bought, which had originally started as a web novel, had many followers. To that, he simply answered, yes. That night, Ryota was lying in bed at home, thinking to himself that he never would have imagined Yuria was an otaku. Just then, his phone buzzed. When he checked it, he saw a text from Eri, asking if he had managed to talk to Yuria about what had happened that morning. However, Ryota decided he'd have to make something up in order to protect Yuria's secret. Shortly afterward, Eri sent another message, assuming it probably wasn't anything important and that it would be best to just forget about it. Then, Eri changed the subject, bringing up the new Starbucks frappe she had mentioned earlier, saying she'd like to try it. Ryota thought to himself that Eri had become quite comfortable with him after the curry bread incident, and figured she'd probably want to keep texting him next week as well. Just then, another notification came through, and this time, it was a message from Yuria. She was thanking him for what had happened that day, and to show her appreciation for the figure, she invited him to go to the movies. With her treat, Ryota was completely stunned by the invitation, internally exclaiming whether Yuria was seriously asking him that. Sensing his reaction, Yuria quickly added that if he didn't want to go to the movies, they could go somewhere else, no problem at all. But Ryota's internal response was immediate and overwhelming. Of course he would go. He was thrilled at the idea of trying the new Starbucks frappe with Eri and then going to the movies with Yuria. After finishing the message, Ryota, still amazed, admitted to himself that something like this was never something he imagined could happen in the life of someone like him. Looking at his planner, he told himself that this must be what it means to live life to the fullest, especially when he saw things written down like, go to the movies with Yuria, and have a frappe with Eri. Later, lying in bed again, he concluded that all this positivity had started with the recent change in seat assignments. That thought immediately brought Rui to mind. He wondered if this fortunate change had been her doing, since she was the one who had suggested the seat rearrangement. As he stared at the ceiling, Ryota wondered whether her action had been intentional. If it had been, he couldn't help but ask himself why a girl like her would assign someone like him to the center seat. He then remembered that the two of them had been classmates back in middle school, though they had never spoken. That memory made him wonder if she might be holding a grudge against him somehow. Full of insecurity, Ryota thought that someone as remarkable as Kuroki Rui surely didn't care at all about a nobody like him. In the end, he tried to calm himself down, convincing himself that he was just overthinking it, and that it had probably been pure coincidence. But elsewhere, under the night sky, someone was looking at a photo of Ryota. It was Kuroki Rui, who, with a sweet yet mischievous smile, let out a quiet sound of satisfaction. The next day, Ryota woke up yawning, noting to himself that it was an especially sleepy morning. Upon arriving at school, he mentioned that he had stayed up late chatting with Yuria online, which explained his exhaustion. He reflected that when the conversation was between otaku, everything changed completely, referring to the passion with which they had talked. As he walked through the locker hallway, Ryota was going about his routine when, suddenly, Rui intercepted him. She greeted him with a smile and called him Izumiya-kun. She quickly approached and commented that it had been raining that morning. The interaction left him confused, wondering whether Rui was really the type of person who would talk so much to someone like him. Soon after, Eri and Yuria greeted Rui cheerfully with a good morning. Rui returned the greeting and then asked if they had shared an umbrella, specifically turning to Yuria and asking if she had felt lonely. Yuria quickly replied that she hadn't, explaining that Eri's umbrella had broken, so they came together. Rui, with a slightly scolding tone and a teasing smile, told Yuria to look at herself and learn to be more honest, while Ryota stood nearby, watching the scene attentively. The protagonist told himself that he had to make absolutely sure no one found out about what had happened the day before. Noticing Yuria's behavior, Rui asked her if something was wrong. Yuria, without hesitation, answered that it was nothing, and promptly said she would go on ahead. Seeing her reaction, Kuroki Rui said she understood. The two friends, Rui and Eri, spoke briefly. The girl with the pigtails asked Rui what was going on, and Rui assured her it was nothing important, suggesting that they head in as well. Ryota watched as Rui turned to leave, and in that instant, she gave him a meaningful smile over her shoulder. That gesture left Ryota completely shaken and stunned, asking himself what that smile had meant. The moment filled him with deep unease, as he wondered whether Rui had already figured out something about his connection with Eri and Yuria. Ryota began to reflect on Kuroki Rui, realizing that not only had she gotten the third highest score on the mock exam, but she had also dominated every event in the athletic competition, making her, without a doubt, a super genius and, on top of that, an extremely beautiful woman. Because of this, he figured the only people who could talk to her on equal terms were the other two girls who were also at the top of the class. His panic grew as he imagined the possibility that her friends might see him as a threat. He wondered if, upon discovering that an introverted otaku like him knew their secrets, the girls would interrogate him in order to protect their friends. This thought pushed him into full panic mode, internally exclaiming that the whole conversation that morning with Rui must have been an investigation. Ryota sat at his desk, covered his head, and admitted to himself that he wasn't entirely sure what was going on. Just then, his phone chimed with a notification. When he checked it, he saw a message from Miyama Eri, asking if they could have lunch together in the classroom on the third floor, explaining that Yuria and Rui would be busy and that she was feeling bored. When Ryota arrived at the meeting place, Eri greeted him in a familiar tone, calling him Ryota. She immediately confronted him, asking what he had been talking about with Rui-chan that morning. Nervous, Ryota told her not to worry and assured her they hadn't been discussing her secret. Eri, however, was caught off guard and clarified that she wasn't talking about that at all. She explained that she just wanted to know why Rui-chan had been in such a good mood. And that was it. Ryota, surprised, asked if Rui had really seemed cheerful. Eri explained that when Rui-chan talked to boys, she usually had a serious expression, like she was looking down on them, but she had noticed that when Rui was talking to Ryota, she actually looked like she was enjoying herself. Then, Eri suddenly had a realization and excitedly exclaimed that Rui-chan must be in love with Izumiya Ryota. Shocked, Ryota immediately denied it, saying she was jumping to conclusions. He explained that he and Rui hadn't had any contact at all before the sea change, but Eri insisted she was sure that was the reason, saying Rui's expressions had been really warm, with a mixture of excitement and conviction. Eri shouted that Rui-chan must have fallen for Ryota without him even noticing, especially since they had gone to the same middle school. Ryota was overwhelmed by the idea, wondering internally what that airhead was even saying. Just then, Eri exclaimed that she had just come up with an idea. Upon hearing that, Ryota had a terrible feeling. After their conversation ended, he decided it would be best to head home early. As he walked, he anxiously wondered what kind of idea Eri could possibly be planning. But just as he was about to leave, he realized his umbrella was gone. At that moment, a voice called out to him, saying she had finally found him. Turning around, Ryota saw Rui, who addressed him by his last name and smiled, saying she had been waiting for him. She was holding an umbrella, his umbrella, which he immediately recognized, leading him to ask if it was really his. Rui explained that her friend Eri had borrowed the umbrella, saying she wouldn't make it in time to a meeting, so Rui had lent it to her. Upon hearing Eri's name, Ryota internally grumbled in frustration at her carefree attitude. Rui went on, saying that Eri, worried Rui wouldn't be able to get home in the rain, had asked her to return the umbrella to Ryota. Finally, Rui apologized for getting him involved in all of it. Although he understood the situation, Ryota remained deep in thought, wondering how Rui had even known the umbrella was his, though at the same time, the context made it somewhat clear. Then, as they prepared to leave, Rui suggested they walk together since they were headed in the same direction. Ryota simply nodded in agreement. As they walked, Rui, holding the open umbrella between the two of them, casually commented that he'd been using that same umbrella since middle school. Ryota immediately reacted with a mix of shock and indignation, asking how she could possibly know something like that. Rui, unfazed, lifted the umbrella and casually commented on how big it was. In response, Ryota quickly offered to hold the umbrella himself, to which Rui simply smiled and told him he was very kind. With his offer accepted, Rui said, "Well then, if you don't mind," and the two of them continued walking together under the rain. At that moment, Ryota, realizing how close they were to each other, visibly blushed. As they walked, Rui suddenly addressed him, calling him Izumiya-kun, and asked quite naturally if he had recently gotten a girlfriend. Ryota was stunned by the question. Eventually, Rui cornered him with a direct follow-up, asking, without hesitation, whether his girlfriend was Yuria or Eri. Faced with such a blunt question, Ryota overreacted in a nervous panic, vehemently denying it and shouting that there was no way either of them would ever date someone like him. Rui, unshaken, calmly pointed out that he was clearly flustered, emphasizing that, usually, Ryota spoke very calmly, but this time he had denied the situation far too quickly. She also noted that the hand he was using to hold the umbrella was trembling slightly. With a confident smile, Rui declared that her conclusion was obvious. He was lying. Internally, Ryota began to panic over Rui's pinpoint deduction, wondering if she was just that good at reading people, or if there was something else going on. As they continued walking, Rui called him by his name again, and then, looking him directly in the eyes, asked why he was lying to her, saying that a friend had told her they'd seen him having lunch with Eri the day before. She then asked if it was true. Pressing further, Rui insisted that he explain how they had become close, asking for a clear and honest answer. Visibly red in the face and sweating from the pressure, Ryota struggled to get the words out. Finally, he managed to say that he had run into Eri by chance at a store the previous day. and that she had given him something he wanted. He just wanted to thank her, that was all. Ryota insisted again that there was nothing going on with Eri, and pleaded with Rui to please believe him. Rui looked at him with a serious, thoughtful expression. But then she smiled softly and said she understood, and that in that case, she was glad. This unexpected response caught Ryota completely off guard, filling him with a mix of nervousness and confusion. As they walked on, Rui began talking about herself. She revealed that for a long time, she had been a perfectionist, someone who pursued absolute perfection both in academics and in sports. She explained that she couldn't feel satisfied unless she reached that perfection, even in the eyes of her parents, her teachers, and everyone else. Ryota was stunned by this revelation, wondering to himself what Rui was even trying to say now. Rui smiled again, and with sincere honesty, confessed that knowing Ryota wasn't involved with Eri had put her mind at ease. That confession hit Ryota hard. His eyes went wide in astonishment. Clearly flustered, he asked Rui what she meant by that. That was when Rui, drawing closer to him step by step, told him that he was the only one who hadn't confessed to her yet. This made Ryota extremely nervous, and in disbelief, he asked if she really meant that he was the only one left. He wondered aloud what had happened to all the other boys who had confessed to her before. With an air of superiority, Rui explained that those other boys, after being rejected, had simply settled for lower quality meat out of spite. As they walked, she added that Ryota was different from those other carnivores because he hadn't tried to find a replacement or even look at anyone else. Then, leaning in dangerously close to his face, Rui confronted him directly. She said that the real reason for his behavior was that he was deeply in love with her, but that he had just been too afraid or too embarrassed to admit it. Ryota, completely overwhelmed and sweating from the pressure, tried to stammer out a denial. However, Rui coldly interrupted him, demanding that he simply admit that he liked her. She then began assuring him that she had no intention of letting him get away, making her firm resolve unmistakably clear. Immediately after, Rui proposed a peculiar game in the middle of the rain, setting just one rule: she wouldn't move from that spot until Ryota finally confessed that he liked her. Faced with such an unexpected challenge, Ryota reacted with disbelief and told her to stop saying nonsense, trying to end the situation by announcing that he was just going to go home. But Rui, using her cunning, tried to manipulate his sense of duty by asking if he was really going to be so heartless as to leave a girl alone and unprotected in the rain. Insisting on her game, she confronted him with a choice. Would he abandon her there, or would he dare to confess and feel better about himself? Internally, Ryota, clearly distressed, reflected on how unfair it would be to make a confession under that kind of pressure. Finally, he broke down emotionally and begged her to stop messing with him. He asked her directly if she would really want to receive a confession in such a forced situation. However, Rui changed her approach. Nervously clasping her hands together, she posed the possibility that her feelings might be genuine. With sincerity, she asked him if he could understand that a confession from him would actually make her very happy. This declaration left Ryota completely stunned. He fell silent, trying to process the possibility that Rui's words weren't a joke. With a blushing face and eyes full of determination, Rui finally opened up. She told Ryota that she was being completely serious and confessed that she had been harboring those feelings since that particular day. The revelation left Ryota in shock, totally paralyzed by the surprise. But before Rui could say another word, the intimate atmosphere was abruptly shattered by the sudden appearance of Yuria, who touched Rui on the shoulder and casually commented that she had finally found her. Seeing Yuria standing in front of them, Ryota couldn't hide his astonishment. Before any misunderstandings could arise, Rui stepped forward coldly and warned that if Ryota had any intentions of flirting, he should try it with someone else, because Rui was currently unavailable. However, Yuria stood her ground, one hand on her hip, and directly questioned them about why they were planning to go home together. She explained that since Eri had taken Ryota's umbrella, she had assumed he would be going back with her instead. Without holding back, she reproached Ryota, reminding him that because she had been busy with preparations for the summer festival, she had specifically asked Rui to wait for him, then asked, with evident distrust, what Rui was doing under her umbrella. trying to process everything. Ryota thought to himself how bizarre the situation was. Everything happening now completely contradicted what Rui had told him just moments earlier. In the tense silence that followed, Rui watched the scene with a sharp and somewhat cold stare, offering no further explanations. Wasting no time, Yuria urged Rui to leave with her already, to which Rui complied with a short and obedient response. The two girls then turned around and walked away together, disappearing down the alley under the rain. Left alone, Ryota tried to make sense of what had just happened. He reflected on how he had escaped from Rui's dangerous game unscathed and felt genuinely grateful to Yuria for her unexpected intervention. Convinced that the best thing now was to go home, he decided to head off, but was stopped by the sound of his phone buzzing in his pocket. When he checked the screen, he saw a message from Ikano's Yuria. She was apologizing for having acted so coldly just a few moments ago. Ryota read the message calmly, thinking to himself that she didn't have anything to worry about. However, his moment of peace was shattered when a new notification popped up on his screen, a message from an unknown contact online. Upon opening the chat, a wave of dread immediately washed over Ryota. The message was from Kuroki Rui, who was writing to inform him that now that their relationship had improved, she had decided to add him as a friend. However, the tone of the message was far from friendly. Rui warned him in a threatening manner that he must keep what had just happened a secret. She also posed a disturbing question. What did he think she might be capable of doing if he dared to tell anyone? Rui continued her message with a declaration of absolute possession, assuring him that, without a doubt, she would make him hers, and concluded by ordering him to wait for her calmly. Ryota, his face contorted with horror, spiraled into a panic at the irony of that request. He wondered how he could possibly wait calmly when all he felt was terrifying fear. Suddenly, the phone slipped from his hands and fell to the ground with a dull thud, soaked by the rain. As the water continued to pour, Ryota went into a state of total shock. Desperately, he asked himself why 3 of the most beautiful girls in his class were after him, someone who had always considered himself a background character of no importance. He then remembered how it all began, that specific encounter, the moment he discovered the deepest secrets of the 3 most popular girls in the class. With his eyes fixed on the phone screen and a resigned expression, he accepted that his peaceful life had come to an end because of that strange chain of events. He couldn't stop wondering how a simple seat change had triggered such chaos. Although he considered himself an ordinary student, just a side character, his reality had been completely transformed. Ryota bitterly reflected on how someone like him, an otaku, should be spending his time, visiting anime stores, playing games in his room, or reading light novels. Yet, in his case, the current situation was far from anything resembling normal student life. In the midst of his nervousness, Ryota clutched his phone tightly as a new notification from Rui made him tremble. Internally, he told himself he needed to think carefully about how to respond to her. However, the messages didn't stop. Soon, Yuria also messaged him, asking if their plan to go see the new Action movie was still on. Almost at the same time, Eri sent a completely different message. She excitedly told him that on her way home, she had found a tadpole. Although she admitted it seemed kind of gross, she couldn't help but find it adorable. Shortly after, another notification from Rui appeared on his screen. This time, she had sent an image. As he read the short message that accompanied the photo, where she talked about a rainbow, Ryota felt unsure. More than anything, he didn't want to respond in an awkward or unpleasant way. And as Rui kept sending him more pictures, he couldn't help but wonder what she was up to now, and whether it might be something dangerous. Finally, with some hesitation, Ryota decided to open the chat and see the contents of the message. Upon opening the image, he found a photo of Rui on the track field, wearing athletic wear that highlighted her figure. She flirtatiously asked him if she looked cute. The impact was immediate. Ryota blushed completely, and although he tried to hold back, he couldn't help but think, with intensity, that Rui looked truly beautiful.